On today's episode, David and I are going to be discussing Scott Voelker's new book, The Take Action Effect, and the lessons that we learned from the book and how we are applying them in our e-commerce business and in our lives. David, welcome.
Thank you. I'm super excited about this. As our listeners probably know, you and I read quite a few books, and this one really stood out. Probably out of the last 20 books, this one has been my favorite, and it's written by a guy named Scott Voelker, who you know personally, and I've been listening to his podcast for several years. And, there have been some times where I will like a podcast, and that individual will write a book, and it doesn't necessarily translate. However, this was not the case with this book. This one, it got me inspired. It really, like, the style of writing was like very raw and honest. Scott talks about mistakes that he made. He talks about his path, which is full of twists and turns. And I just loved this book. And we're going to go into, several lessons learned. But I think in order to understand this book fully, we need to understand the author. So, Ken, last year you attended Brand Accelerator Live, and tell me about Scott.
Yeah. So I found Scott Voelker's podcast, over 2 years ago, The Amazing Seller. So for anybody that's not heard of that, you're under a rock. Come out of the rock and go look at. I think he's got over 1,000 episodes or something, of podcasting experience. But so I've been following Scott for a couple of years now, and I heard last year he was doing his own event, and I thought, man, this sounds like a good, kind of a good crew, and I really respect Scott and his non-flashy persona. Like he doesn't scroll around in Lambos and he's not flashy. So I went to Brand Accelerator Live, and it was a really good event, and got to meet Scott and his team. And you can really tell a lot about somebody by looking at who they surround themselves with, right? Like I said, Scott's not flashy, and he's, really consistent. Like I think what really stood out to me was, like you mentioned, the book was, there's a lot of stuff. The book was written, I think, to add value to your life, right? And it's broken down into very distinct chapters on how to take action, right? The whole thing is take action, but for me, it's like relatable. Scott is relatable, right? Like just a guy you would meet out on the job site, or just a normal guy who has massive amounts of success, and the reason he has that success is because he consistently takes action. So that's Scott in a nutshell.
Absolutely. It's interesting when you listen to a podcast for several years. You have a person in your ear, for potentially hundreds of hours, and you feel like you've gotten to know them. And I have not met Scott in person. I do plan on going to the next Brand Accelerator Live event, but there are a couple things that really stand out to me. One, the guy, when I think of the definition of self-made man, it's him. The title of this book, The Take Action Effect, really personifies his whole attitude on life. There are roadblocks, and he just busts right through them. And we'll talk about several of those throughout the episode. But, not knowing how to do something doesn't seem to ever stop him. He goes out, he finds the resources needed, and he masters the subject at hand. And he's done that over and over again. And, he talks in this book about momentum. Once you accomplish one goal, knocking down goal number 2 and goal number 3 are easier because you can do it. And he started off in construction, made a pivot to photography, and then has been involved in all sorts of e-commerce for probably the last decade. Has a course, has a live event, and has no formal training in any of those, but he has found the information that he needs and seems to be successful.
Yeah, that's when you sit back and unpack that and think about it, it's pretty amazing. One of the stories it's in the book. It's Scott was a contractor working for his dad's company, and he just decided, hey, one day I want I want to do something different, right? I want to spend more time with my family. And, one thing that sticks out in my mind is, he went from a contractor to building these VCR projector machines in his basement. Like, didn't know how to do that, but he's like, well, I'm going to figure out how, I believe the story is he found one and saw that it sold, on eBay or whatever for a lot of money, and was like, hey, I think I can do that. So goes, gets one, tears it apart, figures it out, builds it, and then starts selling those. And and like you had mentioned, consistently pivoting when that dried up or when that changed or another opportunity presented itself. He said, okay, I'm going to try that, right? And over time, like you mentioned, the momentum just built and consistent, steady pivoting and taking action. But yeah, it's kind of amazing story.
The last thing I want to comment about Scott as an individual before we dive into the book has nothing to do with e-commerce. It has to do with him as a person, as it relates to being a family man. He's always talking about his kids. He has built his business for purposes of lifestyle so he can spend more time with his loved ones. That's my goal. That's your goal. I use Stitcher as an app to download all my podcasts, and it keeps track of how many hours you've listened to. And I downloaded that app on my phone a couple years ago. And the other day I listened to 4,200 hours of podcasts. And I have never listened to a single podcast twice. You watch old movies twice, but I've never listened to a single podcast twice, with the exception of episode 786 from the Amazing Seller podcast. And the title of this was The Life and Death Game Important Wake-Up Call. And this was an incredibly deep episode, and I don't want to spoil it for anybody who's listening. And so I'm not going to give anything away, but Scott had a friend was diagnosed with a terminal illness, and he kind of took a step back and in a very emotional way started talking about, what is your why? Why are you doing this? We're all going to die. We need to cherish this time. And I listened to that. It made me emotional when I listened to it. And just the other day, I was getting really frustrated with my business. It's kind of the entrepreneur's roller coaster. And I listened to it again. And it kind of brought me back to earth, made me realize that all of these problems are not important in the grand scheme of things. I have my health. I have my family. There are so many blessings that I have. And in hearing that from a guy like Scott, it made a huge impact on me. And I think everybody should listen to that episode. It's heavy, but there are some much needed lessons in there. And I think you were actually the one that told me about that first.
Yeah, I do remember that episode, and it was, it kind of humbles you. On the last episode we talked about, gratitude and yeah, like it can always be worse, right? Like being thankful for what we have, and sometimes you need a reality check, to slow you down and really be happy with what you have. But yeah, that's a very powerful episode.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think sometimes as entrepreneurs we get, we're always chasing the next best thing. When I first started, I wanted to get $100 in sales a day, then it was 1,000, and then it, so on and so forth, and you're always chasing the next best thing. And an episode like that, and just listening to a lot of his episodes, it kind of makes you realize that, hey, you've already arrived. If you have your health, you have your family, you've already arrived. Yeah. Aubrey Marcus says, welcome to paradise, population everyone. And I really like that saying. Most of us are incredibly blessed and need to count those blessings and quit chasing the proverbial tail during this entrepreneurial journey.
Yeah, absolutely. Another. I mean, there's so many podcast episodes on The Amazing Seller. It's kind of crazy to think about. But another one that I'll just give a quick shout out is, I think it was 800, and Scott gives a glimpse of his life story. Kind of dives into a few pivots that he's made and some of the history. And you know, selling a business, trying to, a different, his history, and that's a really good episode. So I would suggest, go check out that episode. Yeah. So let's. You want to dive into the book, David? So I'm sitting in our podcast studio, and I've got my my signed copy of the Take Action Effect.
So jealous.
I know, it's pretty awesome. So for our listeners, Scott Voelker released the book at Brand Accelerator Live and gave out copies to everybody in attendance. And then, if you stood in a 3-hour line, you could get it signed. So, one of the early chapters, and it's something that Scott talks about really heavy, and it needs to be heavy, is you have to find your why. If without your why, you're probably not going to succeed. And your why has to, if you follow Scott in any of his courses and his teachings, to find your why, it takes a little bit of digging, Your why can't be, I want to make $1 million. Okay, why do you want to make $1 million? Well, I don't want to work. Why don't you want to work? Well, I want to spend my time with, driving my motorcycle. Why do you want to drive your motorcycle? So it just goes deep and deep and deep and deep until you get to your actual why. And then when you find that, that will drive you. That will motivate you. So, coming out, it's in whatever chapter, it's in one of the early chapters, but you have to find that, and you have to have that solidified before you can move on. Yeah, so David, as you read the book early on, what was one of your takeaways?
Scott starts out talking about working in his family's construction business, and there were several things that were not going his way, and he had an opportunity to either stay in that job or make a pivot and take action and do something different. And I see so many people that are unhappy with their situation that don't do anything to improve their situation. It's easy to complain. Anybody can complain. But I think a true measure of an individual is their ability to recognize that I'm not in a great situation and I'm going to take action and get myself out of this situation. And that's exactly what he did. And so I think that, that was one of his first pivots. And I think that takes, the title of our podcast is Fire the Man. He fired the man. That was one of his first pivots. And I think that, you can learn a lot from just hearing other stories of people firing the man. And so that was, the title of the book, Take Action Effect. I mean, that was early on. You could see that Scott was the kind of guy that was going to take action. So, yeah. What about you? What was one of your bigger takeaways?
So, something that, Scott says that really resonates with me is, he always said, he had this dilemma of, he had this job, at his dad's construction company, and it was kind of, it's a stable job and steady money. And, as he thought about, okay, going full-time with this photography business or whatever pivot it was, he, it's like, well, if it doesn't work out, I still have this other skill set, right? So it's like, it's like a safety net, so that I had never really thought about that, so anybody out there that, you're working in a full-time job and you have a side hustle, or, and you think, well, you're scared of going full-time in that side hustle or in a side business, at the end of the day, you're not going to lose your skills that you had from your day job, right? So they're always going to be in your toolbox, right? If you need them there. So I had never really thought about that. It's like always that fear. Fear holds you back in a lot of ways, right? And when I thought about that, I'm like, well, if I go full time with, my side hustle or my business, I'll always have the skills that I have developed through my life and in my career to fall back on, and that's huge.
Absolutely, and he takes those skills with him in part. And so, one example of that, he had worked in construction, was most likely a very handy guy, and one of his first successes in e-commerce was selling props for photography. And, what a great idea. If you listen back to one of our earlier episodes about how to pick a product to sell online, we talk about what specialized interests do you have? What specialized skills do you have? Well, Scott probably had all the tools he needed, and he had the know-how to build these elaborate props for photography, and that was one of the first things that he did. And so, I think that that's an important message, because everybody has something like that. Everybody is good at something. Everybody has a special interest that most other people don't have. And so, his was construction, and he brought that skill with him and gave him a leg up on people that maybe decided to build photography props but had no background in building things.
That it brings us to another point of pivoting. As you read the book, as you go through there, you'll notice that Scott's made multiple pivots throughout his career, whether it was from contracting to photography to building VCR projection machines in his basement, to reselling bridges on eBay, to teaching, just consistently pivoting, being agile and being able to pivot, and like you said, take the skills that you have and move to something else. I'm pretty certain that as a contractor, or as a photographer, I'm pretty certain that Scott wasn't a master at email marketing, but guess what? He is today.
Mm-hmm.
So it's something that that he's learned over consistently taking action.
Absolutely. And when he talks about pivoting, he presents it in a positive light, which is absolutely how I think it should be presented. For some reason in today's society, when people change their mind or they have an opinion and then they change it, they're often looked down upon. You see that in politics all the time, where, he voted for such and such 10 years ago, and now he's voting the other way. And I really think, as you get new information, it's a good idea to assess what you're doing and how you're spending your time. One example he gives in the book is early in their photography business, they were doing weddings. And he said that, the customer's very emotional, right? It's this one day. You may only have one chance to get the perfect shot, and it eats up your weekends. And so he made a small pivot into children's photography and baby photography, where you had unlimited chances to get the perfect shot. And that is, it would have really been a shame if he would have got into wedding photography and didn't like it, but then stuck with it because he felt like he just had to. And I think that, in e-commerce, you and I are making pivots all the time. And it makes you be a little humble and to admit, like, hey, what I was doing was not the best thing to do. That was not the most effective strategy. I'm going to pivot and try something else. And if you're stubborn and you're unwilling to do that, it's going to be tough. Yeah. It's going to be tough in life and in business.
I definitely agree. I've learned more from my failures than my successes, and if you're not willing to pivot and make change, the road's probably going to be very bumpy. It's the more agile you are. One other thing that there's a chapter in the book, and Scott talks a lot about it. Future-proof your business and yourself, right? And I think that speaks a lot to pivoting and being agile. If you see the market changing, you need to change with it. You need to listen to the market, to the audience, see what people are doing, follow them and pivot to them. So David, what was another thing that stood out to you in the book?
There were several things that Scott did and described in this book that he had no previous experience with, photography being one, right? He had worked in construction, and then he was going into photography, and several other things, Photoshop, all kinds of things, starting a podcast. And at the beginning of those, he did not know how to do that. But he was incredibly resourceful. He found people that were already doing what he wanted to do. He took advice from others, and he took action. And that's something, we were talking about just things to be thankful for. One thing I'm incredibly thankful for, and this is going to sound dumb, I'm incredibly thankful for the internet. I mean, you take it for granted, right? It's always there. But literally anything that you want to do, change the oil in your car, lose weight, whatever, there are resources on the internet that have answers. And that's something that you go back 40 years. If you wanted to start a podcast and there was no one in your town that had a podcast and you couldn't find any books on podcasts, well, guess what? You don't, what are you going to do? And so I think like that's something, all the time in my business, there's something that I don't know how to do. But I go out and find the resources and figure it out. And that's something that I think holds a lot of people back, is I don't know how to do that. Well, most people don't. Ken and I have been in e-commerce for a number of years, and I still feel like I'm kind of flying by the seat of my pants. There are on a daily basis things that I don't know how to do, but using the internet, using networking, we go out and find the answers, and you do that by taking action. And so this book is just full of examples like that, where he didn't know how to do something, but he just figures it out. And I think that's, if I could pass lessons on to my son, one of them would be, if you want something, go out and get it. Take action. Don't sit around and talk about what you want to do, or this would be really nice. Go do it. And that's something that I think that is a really valuable skill set to have. And the more times you do it and have success, the better you're going to be at it, at being resourceful and finding people to help you solve the problems that you're trying to solve.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that jumps out at me exactly, it falls in line with what you just said, was, early on, Scott needed to figure out Photoshop. So he went and bought like this massive Photoshop book and taught himself Photoshop. I don't use Photoshop. That shit's hard, right? Like I use Canva or something, or something else. But if you go into Scott's YouTube channel, that Photoshop book is on his bookshelf. It's like this massive Photoshop book. So yeah, he didn't know how to do it, and he was like, I need to learn how to do that and figure it out, and he did. That's taking action.
And the key piece of that is he bought the book, but then he read it. And I know that sounds kind of silly, but like there's a lot of people who will buy a course or they'll buy a book, but they don't do anything with it. And it's just following through on things. I think that's huge. That's huge. That'll make you successful in business. That'll make you successful in relationships, in a marriage, and being a parent is just following through all the way till the end. And so that's, I would not be excited to sit down and read 900 pages about Photoshop. But, Scott did, and look where he is now. And so, yeah, that's a really good example.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as we wrap up the show, was there anything else you wanted to add, David?
This is an odd comment, but I would encourage people to read this book in the morning before they start working. It truly inspired me, and that word is thrown around too much in my opinion. This inspired me, but it did. It did. Hearing all of his pivots and take action moments really inspired me as I was working throughout the day. And so, I've talked about having a good playlist to get you pumped up for the day. I would add this to that list. This book really, it got me fired up. It got me really excited. And there's a lot of books that attempt to do that, to inspire people. But the thing that's cool about this, and probably because I've listened to all of Scott's podcasts, is, he's not just preaching. He does this stuff. This was his story. And so I think that's really cool. I think there's a lot of self-help books out there that everybody knows what we should do, right? You should eat more vegetables. You should exercise. but not everyone does it. And there are a lot of books that are just written about, hey, here are all the things that you should do. But this book comes at it from a totally different perspective. These are things that you should do, and Scott's done, and he shares those lessons with us, and I think that's huge. I've read a lot of similar type books, but no one's done it this well, especially in the e-commerce space. And I would say this applies more broadly to business in general and in life. This was just an incredible book. Probably in my top 10 of all time, and I don't throw that around lightly because I've read quite a few books, and I would put this in the same category as Rich Dad Poor Dad, Principles by Ray Dalio. I mean, this was a high level, awesome book. And to anybody who hasn't read it, take action. Go out on Amazon and buy it right now, or order it from takeactioneffect.com.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll have a link in the show notes to the book, but I want to echo David's remarks on the Take Action Effect, and I highly recommend go out and get that book. I listened to the audio version and I read the book. It's tremendous value. Lots of actionable steps and very relatable. Scott's very he's a down to earth guy, very relatable. Yeah, and that book, the Take Action Effect, should have a pretty positive impact on your life. As we couple shout outs to Scott. If you don't know, he's got the Brand Creators Academy, and it's his latest project. And it's where he teaches you to build a brand the proper way, slow and steady. I'm in that tribe, and it's amazing. And Brand Creators Playbook, that you can Google that and get to a funnel and get in there.
Yeah. All right, Ken, to close out this episode, 2 words. The first 2 words that come to your mind when you think of this book. Just say them. I'll say them.
Ready?
1, 2, 3. Take action. Nice.